The leather-bound diary sat untouched for 3 days before anyone realized what Thomas Lockridge had written inside. By then, Margaret Ashford was already dead, exactly as he had described, and the town of Mercy would never be the same. Mercy, Missouri, January 1869, a town on the threshold of the Missouri Plains, where clapboard houses huddled along muddy paths and the railroad's unfinished promise snaked beyond the southern edge. Life here was brittle and unforgiving. Endurance was paid for with calloused hands and hope worn thin by wind and circumstance. But what no one could endure was the suspicion that fate itself had lodged beneath their ribs like a splinter. Thomas Lockridge, the new schoolmaster, was a quiet man of 35 with sad wire-rimmed eyes and the posture of someone trained to expect less from the world. He came with little more than a suit, a box of books, and that diary, a gift from a Boston cousin, its cover stamped with initials that matched his own. He had been in Mercy only 8 weeks, long enough for the children to mimic his gentle accent, for the storekeeper to trust him for flour, for neighbors to wonder why he never spoke about his former life. Lockridge wrote each night by the dim glow of a lantern, the diary a confidant for thoughts that never shaped themselves into words for others. Wednesday, January 13th. He scribbled a passage before bed, almost carelessly. Margaret Ashford will not see another sunrise. The words, once written, seemed strange even to him, an unbidden notion, sleep-deprived and feverish, that he nearly forgot by morning. But dawn came, and with it, the news that Margaret, the midwife, was found cold in her cottage, her hands folded over her apron, eyes fixed wide upon the ceiling. That afternoon Mercy was swept by rumor. Some whispered that Thomas Lockridge had dreamed it, that he was touched by the devil, others that it was some shocking coincidence. Lockridge himself was stunned into silence, standing at the edge of an open grave, as Margaret's brother spoke too softly for the living. In the evenings, after the heat of speculation had passed, Lockridge burned with shame. He tried to reason. Perhaps he had heard Margaret coughing in the weeks before. Maybe he unconsciously sensed her illness. The town let it go, hungering for distraction in the dead of winter. But the pattern did not break. By the month's end, 3 more names appeared in his diary. 3 deaths followed. Tommy Wilkes, the wheelwright's youngest son, who drowned breaking through the river's ice at dusk. Orla Beavis, an old wanderer, found lost in the prairie mist. And Samuel Prewitt, crushed beneath a collapsed roof during a snowstorm. Each name came a day, sometimes hours, before the fatal event. Each time, Thomas remembered nothing except the silent compulsion to write, but the connection soon became impossible to ignore. It was the preacher's wife, Agnes Howe, who confronted him after Sunday service. Her voice, relentless and cold, echoed in the empty sanctuary. "You know something you aren't telling us. These deaths follow your hand." Lockridge denied it weakly, as terrified as he was ashamed. He stopped writing. He hid the diary under a floorboard. He locked his pen away and kept to himself, bracing against the winter and the restless curiosity of townsfolk who now watched him as though he were a plague. But nothing stopped fate. The deaths did not cease. On a sleepless night in February, unable to resist, Thomas unearthed the diary. His hands trembled as he wrote, "There will be another," not even knowing to whom the words referred. The next morning, a barn on the outskirts collapsed after a night of wet snow, killing a dray horse and its young caretaker, Sophie Stillwater. No one spoke to Thomas in the days after. Behind doors, he heard his name paired with whispers about curses and predestined evil. Mercy, Missouri, a place already hounded by prairie fires and cholera, found itself trapped by a new fear, one written in Lockridge's careful hand, one that did not ask for their belief. Spring arrived with as little warning as death. The snow around Mercy's edge melted into slush, soaking boots and chilling bones on the walk to the unpainted church. Townsfolk worked their fields, wrung out blankets, and recounted the winter's losses as though inventorying seeds. By then, Lockridge's diary was legend. Children dared each other to peer in his window at night, and even Constable Elwood left his hands politely visible when making a rare call at Thomas's door. A hush followed Thomas along the street, a hush that stung less than outright blame, but never left him alone. Yet Thomas, haunted by the inexplicable compulsion to write, resumed his midnight entries. He felt relief and dread intermingled in the act, as if he were both liberator and jailer of Mercy's fate. Desperate for answers, he documented everything: the sense of burning wood, the sound of the town bell, the rhythm of footfalls and fading laughter. One March evening, Thomas's diary inked a name before his conscious mind knew why: Jacob Fenley, ferryman. Jacob, a giant of a man, ferried passengers, goods, livestock, the occasional hopeful family, across the wide river at Mercy's northern edge. He was beloved for his cheer and trusted hands, a figure as constant as the town's old maple tree. Before sunrise, Jacob was found lifeless in the icy shallows, his boat tangled in a web of roots. The town, reeling again, approached Lockridge for confirmation, treating him not as oracle but as suspect. Sheriff Carrow, his hat gripped tight, interviewed Lockridge in the lockup's one-room office. "You sure you didn't see something? You sure you didn't hear?" Thomas's denials rang hollow, grief making his body rigid. At home, after the sheriff left, he wept, powerless, frightened, yet unable to stop the nightly confessions to his waiting diary. Word of Mercy's fate spread beyond, carried by traders and travelers who crossed the railway path. A journalist from Kansas City arrived, staying in the overcrowded inn, his coat buttoned high and pencil always at the ready. He questioned everyone, about the diary, about Thomas's background, about the string of tragedies haunting the town. For the first time, Thomas questioned if the entries in his diary might be something more than prophecy. Were they invitations, warnings? He pored over each page, searching for clues, for some pattern in the timing and manner of each demise. The town's preacher, Reverend Dunstable, sought to console his ragged congregation, but his sermons sounded brittle, faith thinned by repeated blows. "We do not know the Lord's plan," he declared, voice cracking as much from cold as conviction. "But we must not assign guilt to that which we cannot explain." But fear breeds suspicion. At home, behind thresholds, Mercy's families whispered reckoning. Barn doors were double-locked. Mothers woke children early, keeping them close at hand. Customary gatherings were suspended, leaving the spring air thick with apprehension. The Lockridge diary itself became an object of fascination and terror. Some wanted it burned, others demanded it be brought before the town's council. Thomas refused every call for its destruction, whether out of guilt, hope for understanding, or sheer stubbornness he could not say. The death toll crept upward, each tragedy mapped and measured by townspeople hungry for connections. A heartbreak here, a broken wagon there, each event recorded in Lockridge's hand before the dust ever settled. One April dawn, Thomas found he had written a page describing the schoolhouse: smoke, screams, the splintering of wood. That day, lightning struck the bell tower during a spring storm. No children died, but the teacher's aide and a janitor both perished, and half the structure was lost to fire. Among the ashes, Thomas Lockridge's presence was both a curse and a consolation. The children, too young to grasp fate, clung to him. The rest of Mercy watched and waited for the next ink-stained prediction, equal parts dread and desperate hope that the diary's power might point them to safety, or perhaps, finally, to understanding. In late May, the town held a somber gathering on the green, beneath the newly budded trees that stood sentinel over Mercy. The pretense was a spring festival, but the shadow of the Lockridge diary loomed over every conversation, unspoken but ever present. Lockridge himself kept to the edge of the crowd, watching the cycles of daily life continue. A girl tugging her braid, two boys skimming flat stones, old Mrs. Darby scolding her dog. He wished for the gift of invisibility, to move among neighbors without the constant weight of expectation and fear. As the sky bruised toward evening, the diary called to him with a silent, irresistible pull. He left early, hands shaking as he entered his home. That night's entry was worse than any before. A list, not a name, but 3. Elias Brown, Georgia Moss, Callum Frisk, by dawn. Thomas's hands quivered so violently he nearly spilled ink on the page. He tried to stop himself, to believe that his will could alter fate. But morning came, and Elias, Georgia, and Callum were dead, 2 perished in a prairie fire when their wagon overturned, and the 3rd from a fever that raged through the night. The deaths, with their different causes, proved that the diary's power was not limited to a single kind of misfortune. It was indiscriminate, terrifyingly varied, and relentless. The constable and sheriff met with Reverend Dunstable and decided to confiscate the diary at last. Perhaps removing it from Lockridge's hands could put an end to the nightmare. In the town hall before the uneasy council, the diary sat unopened upon the mayor's desk. Townspeople filled the benches, some hoping for a solution, others simply eager for drama. Thomas stood straight, eyes hollow but resolved. He spoke of his compulsion, of sleepless nights, and the sense of impending doom that invaded his thoughts each evening. "I do not summon these events," he pleaded. "I am merely the scribe. The words choose me." Councilman White, ever the skeptic, moved to burn the diary. But Reverend Dunstable, moved by mercy or fear, intervened, suggesting it be kept in the church, a place safe from both irreverence and exploitation. The diary's presence in the church calmed Mercy for a time. The next 2 weeks passed without loss, the semblance of peace returning. Thomas, though exhausted, allowed hope to flicker, until an evening in June when an altar candle sputtered and died. That night the diary's pages were found torn from their binding, words written not in Lockridge's familiar hand, but in the erratic scrawl of a child. Panic rolled through the town. A new set of names appeared, children this time written out in the night. Thomas, horrified, confronted Reverend Dunstable, who stood over the book, hands trembling as he tried to make sense of new pages no one claimed to have written. It became clear that the diary itself, or perhaps whatever force animated it, did not need Lockridge alone. Even removed from his hands, fate found a way to write its narrative, using other innocents as conduits. By the end of June, the council realized that only by facing the truth of Mercy's shared fear, not in a book or a scapegoat, but in their lives, could they hope to break the sequence. But whether truth alone was enough would be tested yet again as summer dawned and the river's banks swelled with rain. The air grew thick with the scent of storm and the threat of disease. Thunder rolled over the rooftops, and the river threatened the town's fragile perimeter with each rain-soaked night. Cholera, whispered in hushed tones, took its first victim in early July, a beloved baker with a kind word for every child and a loaf for every wedding. Even as dread tightened around Mercy like a noose, the Lockridge diary had gone missing. The book vanished from the church's altar, 3 pages torn out and scattered behind the pulpit. Panic spread. Every home was turned over twice, warnings nailed to fence posts. It seemed the town believed the deaths could only be stopped by destroying the book outright. Lockridge, more ghost than man, searched each day and night. He traced rumors from stable boy to widow, following any lead, desperate to reclaim not power but understanding, some logic to the madness that had befallen his town. When the diary reappeared, it lay on the grave of Sophie Stillwater, her name among the first to have been written in its pages. The cover was waterlogged, ink bled into unintelligible lines, but in the dim light of a stormy dusk, Thomas could still discern fresh writing inside, the name of the town's doctor, William Greaves. This time, the diary's curse could not be hidden. The whole town gathered at Greaves's house, waiting in anxious silence. As midnight neared, thunder pealed, and Greaves stepped out, alive but visibly shaken. He had received a letter, anonymous, but echoing the precise words scrawled in the diary, that foretold his end. The predictions, it seemed, were spreading beyond the pages, infecting the town like an airborne plague. Faced with the reality that the curse had outgrown Lockridge's hand, the townspeople convened in the square. There, under the torchlit sky, decisions were made, not of retribution, but of mutual reliance. They posted lookouts at river and road, shared beds in the sick room, and drew together in a unity born not of hope, but of necessity. As they shifted from fear to vigilance, Thomas found something resembling peace. For the first time in months he slept, a restless, uneasy sleep, but sleep nonetheless. The diary, sealed in a church steeple, was left untouched for days. But as July closed, Mercy felt the balance teeter once more. The diary's legend had twisted beyond Lockridge, shifting from the domain of the written to that of spoken dread. Anyone could be the next hand to hold the pen, the next cause or victim of the cycle. The final death yet unwritten loomed ahead, waiting to see whether Mercy's fear would destroy them all, or whether unity might finally break the chain. The next chapter would reveal if fate could be unmade, or if the Lockridge diary would claim one last reckoning. August arrived with relentless heat, the kind that split timber and withered hope. Mercy's streets turned to dust, and the river, once threatening flood, dwindled to a sluggish thread. The townspeople moved through their days with exhaustion etched into their faces, each person carrying the weight of too many funerals and too little understanding. Thomas Lockridge had aged visibly in the months since winter. His shoulders hunched forward as though bearing an invisible burden, and his eyes had taken on the hollow quality of someone who had seen too much. The diary remained locked in the church steeple, but its absence brought no comfort. The deaths continued, though now they came without warning, without the cruel mercy of prediction. The town doctor, William Greaves, had become an unlikely ally to Thomas. After surviving the night his name appeared in scattered pages, Greaves dedicated himself to understanding the pattern. Together, in the small hours before dawn, they studied everything Thomas had written, searching for connections that might explain the inexplicable. There must be logic to it, Greaves insisted one sweltering evening, his spectacles sliding down his sweat-dampened nose. Even fate follows rules. But Thomas knew better. He had felt the compulsion that drove his hand across those pages, and there was nothing logical about it. It was instinct, pure and terrible, like a bird that senses the coming storm. The town's children, surprisingly resilient in the face of tragedy, created games around the legend. They would dare each other to stand beneath the church steeple at midnight or to touch the door of Lockridge's home. Their parents, too weary to scold, let them play, perhaps grateful that innocence could still find purchase in such dark soil. But innocence proved fragile. On the 15th of August, young Timothy Marsh disappeared. The boy, barely 7, had been playing near the abandoned mill when he vanished without trace. Search parties scoured the prairie, calling his name until their voices grew raw. Thomas joined them, driven by guilt and desperate hope, though he knew in his bones what the outcome would be. They found Timothy 3 days later, drowned in a shallow creek bed that should have been too shallow for drowning. The water had risen suddenly during a brief storm, they reasoned, but Thomas remembered no entry about the boy, no warning in his diary. This death belonged to chance, not fate, yet it felt no different. The grief was the same. Reverend Dunstable held the service on a Wednesday afternoon, the church packed with mourners, whose faces had become too familiar with loss. He spoke of God's mysterious ways, of trials that test faith, but his words rang hollow, even to himself. The congregation sat in silence, and when the final hymn was sung, it sounded more like surrender than praise. That night, Thomas dreamed of the diary. In his dream, the pages were blank, pristine white paper waiting for words that would never come. He woke with tears on his face and an overwhelming urge to write. Fighting against it felt like holding his breath underwater, painful, futile, ultimately impossible. He retrieved the diary from the church before sunrise, breaking the lock with shaking hands. The leather felt warm, almost alive, and when he opened it, he saw that new words had appeared in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing them. The entry was dated that very morning. The town of Mercy will lose its heart. Thomas ran through empty streets to find Dr. Greaves, the diary clutched against his chest. They sat in Greaves's parlour as dawn broke, trying to decipher the meaning. A heart? Was it metaphorical? Would someone beloved die? Or did it mean something more literal, more catastrophic? By noon, the answer came. Fire broke out in the town square, sparked by a lantern left burning in the general store. The flames spread with terrifying speed, consuming the store, the adjacent hotel, and finally the town hall, where records dating back to Mercy's founding were kept. The volunteer brigade fought valiantly, but the heat was too intense, the wind too strong. When the flames finally died, a third of Mercy's center was gone. No lives were lost, but something essential had been destroyed, the physical heart of their community. The places where they had gathered, traded, governed themselves. The prophecy had been fulfilled in a way none of them had anticipated. In the aftermath, covered in soot and defeat, the townspeople gathered in the church. Mayor Hendricks, his voice rough from smoke, called for order. "We cannot continue like this," he said. "We must decide. Do we abandon mercy, or do we face whatever curse has taken hold?" The debate lasted hours. Some families had already made plans to leave, to seek fresh starts in Kansas City or St. Louis. Others, those whose roots ran deep, refused to be driven from their homes by fear and misfortune. Thomas listened from the back pew, knowing that any decision would be shaped by the diary he held. Finally, Agnes Howe, the preacher's wife who had first accused him, stood. Her face was gaunt, her dress threadbare, but her voice carried conviction. "We have blamed this man," she said, pointing at Thomas. "But perhaps the diary is not the cause, perhaps it is merely the witness, perhaps mercy itself is being tested." Her words shifted something in the room. If the diary was witness rather than weapon, then Thomas was not their enemy. The question became not how to punish him, but how to survive what the diary revealed. As the meeting dissolved, tentative alliances formed. Neighbors who had stopped speaking began to plan together. Thomas left the church as the sun set, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of amber and blood. He carried the diary back to his home, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than dread. It was not quite hope. Hope seemed too fragile for what they faced, but perhaps it was determination. The diary would continue its predictions. Fate would continue its march, but mercy would face it together, bound not by certainty, but by the courage to endure. September brought cooler nights, and the first hints of autumn color to the trees that lined Mercy's outskirts. The town had begun rebuilding, though progress was slow and arguments frequent. Every decision, where to place the new store, whether to reconstruct the town hall or build something simpler, became weighted with symbolism and superstition. Thomas Lockridge found himself in an unexpected role. No longer pariah, he had become something like a seer, consulted before major decisions. People would visit his home, awkward and apologetic, asking if the diary had revealed anything about their plans. He always answered honestly. The diary wrote what it wanted, when it wanted, and he was merely the instrument. The entries had become less frequent, but more cryptic. Instead of names and dates, Thomas found himself writing fragments. The well runs dry. Copper turns to rust. 3 birds fly south too late. Dr. Greaves theorized that perhaps the diary's power was waning or evolving, becoming less specific as the town learned to live with uncertainty. But uncertainty bred its own anxieties. Martha Colson, the seamstress, developed a nervous condition that kept her indoors. Young Peter Grimm, the blacksmith's apprentice, quit his position and joined a traveling merchant, desperate to escape what he called the weight of waiting. Even Reverend Dunstable showed cracks, his sermons growing increasingly abstract, filled with references to Job and trials by fire. On the morning of September 10th, Thomas woke to find he had written a complete paragraph in his sleep. His hand was stained with ink, and the diary lay open beside his pillow. The entry described a woman standing at a crossroads at sunset, choosing between 2 paths. One led to a house with golden windows, the other disappeared into shadow. He shared the entry with Dr. Greaves over breakfast. "It sounds like a parable," Greaves observed, buttering his bread thoughtfully. "Perhaps the diary is learning to speak in metaphor." They discussed possible meanings. Was it about the town's choice to rebuild or abandon, about individual decisions each person faced? Or was it, as Thomas secretly feared, simply nonsense, his mind finally breaking under the strain? The answer came 3 days later, when Clara Whitmore, a widow who ran the boarding house, announced she was leaving Mercy. She had received an offer to manage a hotel in Kansas City, a position with security and respectability. The town understood. Clara had lost her husband to cholera the previous year, and Mercy held nothing but memories of loss for her. But Clara's departure sparked something. Within a week, 2 more families announced they were leaving, then 5. The trickle became a stream, threatening to become a flood. Those who remained grew desperate, offering incentives, shared resources. promises of community support. But fear is a powerful motivator, and many had reached their limit. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility. Had his diary caused this exodus? If he had never come to Mercy, would these people still have homes, still have hope? Dr. Greaves, sensing his spiral, confronted him in his study one evening. "You did not bring death to Mercy," Greaves said firmly. "Death comes to every town, every family. The diary simply made visible what we prefer to keep hidden. Our mortality, our lack of control. That is uncomfortable, but it is not evil." The words helped, though they could not erase Thomas's guilt. He continued his nightly vigils, pen in hand, waiting for the compulsion that would drive him to write. Sometimes it came, sometimes it did not. The unpredictability was somehow worse than the certainty had been. As October arrived, Mercy's population had shrunk by nearly a third. The remaining residents developed a dark camaraderie, the kind born of shared struggle. They helped each other harvest before the first frost, shared preserved foods, and took turns maintaining the buildings that had been abandoned. The town had always been hard, but now it was harder still, stripped of pretense and false comfort. One afternoon, while helping to repair the church roof, Thomas noticed something that had been invisible before. From this height, he could see the patterns in Mercy's layout, the way the streets curved around the original settlement, the relationship between church and square and river. It looked almost intentional, as though the town had been designed according to some plan he could not quite grasp. That night, the diary wrote itself again. Thomas watched, half asleep, as his hand moved across the page. The pattern was always there. Mercy was built on borrowed time, each day a gift unearned. What comes next was always coming. He shared this with Greaves, who stared at the words for a long time before speaking. "It sounds like the diary is saying the deaths were not caused by prediction, but were simply inevitable, that Mercy was always meant to be temporary." The idea was both terrifying and oddly liberating. If Mercy's struggles were not punishment or curse, but simply the natural course of things, then perhaps there was no one to blame, nothing to fix. Perhaps survival meant accepting impermanence, building even when knowing what was built would eventually fall. The townspeople, when Thomas shared this interpretation, reacted with mixed emotions. Some found comfort in the idea that their suffering had no author, no malice behind it. Others rejected it, preferring to believe in the diary's power, because powerlessness felt worse than being cursed. As autumn deepened and the first snow threatened, Mercy stood at its own crossroads. The diary continued its cryptic entries, Thomas continued his reluctant transcription, and the people continued their daily work of survival. They buried their dead, celebrated small victories, and learned to live with the knowledge that tomorrow was never guaranteed. In this, they were no different from any other town, any other people. The diary had simply made them honest about it. Winter was coming again, and with it, the final chapters of Mercy's story would be written, not in ink and leather, but in the choices of those who remained, in their determination to endure even when endurance seemed impossible. The Lockridge diary had predicted many deaths, but it could not predict the resilience of those who survived, who woke each morning and chose, against all reason, to hope. The first snow of November fell silently over Mercy, covering the scarred landscape in white that made everything look clean and new, at least until morning when boots and wagon wheels would turn it to grey slush. Thomas Lockridge stood at his window, watching the flakes accumulate on windowsills and rooftops, and wondered if this would be Mercy's last winter. The town's population had stabilized around 500 souls, those too stubborn or too poor to leave. They had adapted to their reduced circumstances, consolidating into fewer buildings, sharing resources with a pragmatism that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The diary's predictions had become part of the rhythm of life, noted and prepared for as one might prepare for storms or drought. Dr. Greaves had developed a system. Whenever Thomas reported a new entry, Greaves would analyze the language, consulting with Mayor Hendricks and Reverend Dunstable to determine what precautions could be taken. They could not prevent the predicted events, but they could sometimes mitigate them, moving livestock before a barn was mentioned, keeping children home when the diary wrote of schools, posting guards when it hinted at violence. This November entry was different. Thomas had written, The snow will cover the truth, but spring will reveal what was always buried here. The word sent Dr. Greaves into a frenzy of research. He combed through land records, spoke with the oldest residents, traced property lines and original surveys. What he discovered changed everything. Mercy had been built on the site of an earlier settlement, one that had failed after a single winter. The original colonists, 20 families from Ohio, had arrived in the autumn of 1854, full of optimism and plans. By spring, only 7 people remained. The rest had perished from disease, exposure, and what the survivors called a darkness that took hold in the mind. The survivors had burned the buildings and scattered, never speaking of what had happened. The land had lain empty for 5 years before new settlers, ignorant of its history, had established the town of Mercy. No one had thought to ask why good land near water and timber had remained unclaimed. Thomas absorbed this information with growing horror. Had the diary been responding to some echo of that earlier tragedy? Were the deaths in Mercy simply history repeating itself? The land itself somehow cursed or tainted? Or was this another pattern humans imposed on random misfortune, desperate for meaning where none existed? He called a town meeting, insisting that everyone needed to know what Greaves had discovered. The church was full despite the cold, breath-forming clouds in the unheated space. Thomas stood before them and told the story of Mercy's forgotten foundation, watching their faces shift from curiosity to fear to a kind of grim acceptance. "What do we do with this information?" Mayor Hendricks asked when Thomas had finished. "Do we leave? Do we stay and hope we fare better than they did?" Agnes Howe, who had become an unlikely voice of reason, stood slowly. "My grandmother used to say that the land remembers, that places hold on to what happens on them. Maybe Mercy has been trying to tell us its story all along, through this diary, through these deaths. Maybe it wants to be abandoned, to rest." Her words sparked fierce debate. Some agreed, seeing the pattern of failure as proof they should leave. Others argued that abandoning the town meant the earlier settlers' deaths had been for nothing, that running from fear was no way to live. The meeting broke up without resolution, families retreating to their homes to make private decisions. Thomas found himself visited by a steady stream of residents over the following days. Each came with questions. What had he written recently? Did the diary mention them? Should they stay or go? He answered as honestly as he could, though honesty felt inadequate in the face of such need. The diary, as if responding to the town's turmoil, wrote with increasing frequency. Thomas filled pages with entries that seemed to describe Mercy's original founding, images of wagons arriving, of men cutting timber, of women hanging curtains in rough cabins. Then came darker images, fever dreams, children crying, graves dug in frozen ground. It was as though the diary had become a conduit for the land's memory, channeling stories that had never been recorded. Dr. Greaves grew obsessed with documenting everything. He believed that understanding the complete history might reveal a pattern they could break, a way to save Mercy from repeating the cycle. He worked late into the night, correlating Thomas's new entries with historical records, weather patterns, disease outbreaks. His wife, Ellen, worried openly about his health, but Greaves would not be deterred. On the first day of December, Thomas wrote an entry that seemed to mark a turning point. "The dead do not ask to be remembered, but neither can they rest forgotten. Mercy was named for the compassion it hoped to find. Let it offer that mercy now to the past and to itself." The words felt like permission, though for what, Thomas could not say. He shared them with the town at Sunday service, and afterwards something shifted. People began leaving flowers at the town's edge, in the area where the original settlement would have stood. Someone carved a simple memorial from prairie stone, listing no names because none were known, just the dates, 1854-1855, and the words, "The First of Mercy." The gesture was small, but it seemed to ease something in the town's collective spirit. The diary's entries became less frequent, less urgent. Thomas still felt the compulsion to write, but it no longer felt like drowning. It felt like bearing witness, which was different. Painful still, but purposeful. As December progressed, no more deaths occurred. The town held its breath, afraid to hope, but unable to suppress it entirely. Children played in the snow, their laughter bright against the white landscape. Merchants planned for spring inventory. Young couples made promises by firelight. Life, stubborn and precious, continued. Thomas knew better than to believe the curse, if it had ever been a curse, was broken. But perhaps it had been satisfied, or simply grown tired. Or perhaps the town's acknowledgement of its past had changed something fundamental about its present. The diary sat on his desk, closed but never far from reach. A reminder that some questions had no answers, only the requirement to keep living in their shadow. Winter deepened around Mercy, and the town, diminished but determined, settled in to wait for spring. Whatever would be revealed when the snow melted, they would face it together, bound not by the certainty of survival, but by the choice to try, which might be the only mercy any of them would ever find. Spring came early to Mercy, the snow melting in great rushing streams that turned the prairie into a temporary sea of mud and wildflowers. Thomas Lockridge stood at the town's edge as the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, and felt something he had not experienced in over a year: anticipation without dread. The diary had been silent for 3 months, not dormant. Thomas still kept it close, still felt its presence like a second heartbeat, but quiet, as though whatever force had driven it to chronicle death had found peace or moved on. He did not trust the silence entirely, but he had learned to live within it, to take each unmarked day as a gift. Dr. Greaves had aged visibly over the winter, his obsessive research giving way to exhausted acceptance. His documentation of the town's history now filled 2 ledgers, meticulously cross-referenced and annotated. He spoke of publishing it someday, creating a record so that Mercy's struggles would not be forgotten like those of the first settlers. Thomas supported the idea, though he wondered who would want to read such a catalogue of loss. The town itself had transformed. Where fear had once divided neighbours, shared survival had created bonds stronger than proximity alone could forge. Families took turns hosting communal dinners. The rebuilt general store operated on a barter system when money ran short. Even Reverend Dunstable had changed, his sermons less about divine judgment and more about human endurance, the small sacred acts of choosing to continue. As the ground dried enough for planting, Mayor Hendricks organized a survey of the area where the original settlement had stood. Using Dr. Greaves's research and Thomas's winter diary entries, they mapped the likely locations of the first cabins and graves. What they found both confirmed and complicated the story. Beneath the surface, they uncovered remnants, rotted timbers, rusted tools, fragments of pottery. But they also found something unexpected: carefully buried seed stores, preserved through some luck of soil and temperature. The original settlers had not simply died of disease or exposure. They had prepared for spring, had believed they would survive to plant and harvest. Their end had come swiftly after hope, which somehow made it worse. Thomas helped excavate what Greaves called the Mercy Cache, a collection of items the first settlers had buried for safekeeping. There were letters never sent, a child's wooden doll, a woman's wedding ring, a Bible with names inscribed on the first page. These remnants transformed the faceless dead into people, made their loss specific and therefore more real. The town held a proper memorial service on the first warm Sunday in April. They gathered at the new stone marker, and Reverend Dunstable read the names from the discovered Bible aloud, giving the forgotten settlers the recognition they had been denied. As he spoke, Thomas felt the diary in his coat pocket grow warm, then cool, as though acknowledging what was being done. That night, he opened the diary for the first time in months. His hand moved across a fresh page without the old compulsion, writing words that felt like his own. Today Mercy remembered. In remembering, it chose mercy for itself. The pattern breaks not because death has ended, but because we have learned to honor it without being consumed. He read the words to Dr. Greaves the next morning, over coffee in the rebuilt general store. Greaves was quiet for a long moment, then smiled, a real smile, not the grim expression that had become his default. "Do you think it's over?" he asked. "I think death is never over," Thomas replied. "People will continue to die in Mercy as they do everywhere. But maybe the diary will no longer need to predict them. Maybe we have learned to accept mortality without needing prophecy to prepare us." Over the following weeks, Thomas tested his theory by deliberately trying to write predictions. His hand moved across the page easily enough, but the words were ordinary. His own observations and thoughts rather than the uncanny knowing that had characterized the diary's entries. It seemed the compulsion had released him. Life in Mercy resumed its ordinary rhythms, planting and tending, births and yes, deaths, but deaths that came naturally, their timing unknown and therefore bearable. The diary became an artifact, a reminder of a dark year rather than an ongoing torment. Thomas even began teaching again, the children gradually losing their fear of him as normalcy reasserted itself. In late May, a family of newcomers arrived, drawn by stories of available land and a tight-knit community. They knew nothing of the diary or the deaths, seeing only a town that had survived and was building toward a future. Mayor Hendricks welcomed them without mentioning the past, believing that some stories were better left sleeping. But Thomas insisted on telling them, on walking the newcomers to the memorial stone and explaining what had happened on this land, in this town. "You deserve to know," he said simply, "not to frighten you, but to remind all of us that this place, this life was earned through suffering and courage. That makes it precious." The newcomers stayed, sobered but not deterred. Their presence felt like validation, proof that Mercy could sustain life, could grow beyond its dark history. They built a small house near the river, planted a garden, and by summer's end, the woman was expecting a child. As autumn approached again, Thomas reflected on the year that had passed since the diary first fell silent. Mercy had not prospered in any material sense. The population remained small, resources were limited, life was hard. But something essential had been preserved, the will to continue, the capacity to hope even when hope seemed foolish. The diary sat on his shelf now, just another book among his small collection. He no longer checked it daily, no longer feared what he might find written there. If it chose to speak again, he would listen. If it remained silent, he would accept that too. He had learned finally that prediction and control were illusions. All anyone could do was live as well as possible in the face of uncertainty, showing mercy to others and occasionally, when strength allowed, to themselves. Winter would come again to Mercy, and spring, and all the seasons that followed. People would be born and die, love and grieve, struggle and endure. The town would change, grow or diminish, according to forces beyond any diary's power to predict. And Thomas Lockridge, no longer the cursed seer, but simply a man who had witnessed extraordinary things, would continue to teach Mercy's children, to keep the town's difficult history alive, and to live each unmarked day as the gift it had always been. The Lockridge diary had predicted every death in the town of Mercy during that terrible year of 1869, but it could not predict what mattered most: the resilience of the survivors, their capacity to transform suffering into solidarity, fear into compassion. That story, written in choices rather than ink, in community rather than prophecy, was the true legacy of Mercy. And it was a story that would continue, unwritten but lived, for as long as people chose to stay, to build, to hope in this hard, unforgiving, beautiful place they called home. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.